welcome back to another episode of the Empowerful Health Podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Sherry Jackson. Welcome to the podcast, Sherry.
Thank you, Dr. Kerrigan. I appreciate that.
So tell us just a little bit about yourself, what you do, the name of your business, and then we'll dive into our conversation.
Okay. Well, I am a clinical hypnotherapist, and my business is Envisage Wellbeing. So it's a very fascinating and rewarding profession, I must say.
Awesome. We're going to talk about two things today with your profession. One is we wanted to dispel a few myths about hypnotherapy. And then two, just hear how you got into that. Like what inspired you to do this and what kind of things you love helping people with. So let's start with your origin story, if you will. Tell us how you got into this.
Well, it started really a long time ago, even though it was a long journey. My first interest was in clinical psychology, and I did a lot of research and development. I was PhD tracked, and life takes its twists and turns. And my fiance at the time was also in grad school, and we were in different countries. And so I left my clinical program, and because we didn't want to do the long distance thing, and I moved to the States, where I then became a banker in the corporate world. And I spent a great career managing banks and working at the Federal Reserve as well.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
For better or worse. We won't go into the Federal Reserve on
No.
the podcast today. But so you left the clinical, and then what got you back into that? You said you had a long career, 20 years or so in the banking industry.
Yeah, about 18 years. And so what really got me back into it? And that's a really good question, because what I found was the thread that kept me really happy and engaged was developing people. I had the opportunity to develop future CEOs and even from the teller line up. And then that was the thing that I really loved. I used my skills in psychology in the business world more than, it's great to know how to do the spreadsheets and the accounting and all of that stuff.
Right.
But it was really the psychology that allowed me to move up in my career and to have great success in it.
I've actually read before that people who do marketing want to hire people with a psychology degree because they understand how people think and how they make decisions, which again, in a managing role is an important part of that. I just was talking to someone recently about how people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses, and a good boss is going to have the skills to develop and lift everybody, help them achieve their full potential. So it's really cool that you were able to see that connection. I'm sure you were a great boss then if you were using these skills.
I loved it. I saw myself as one thing as a servant leader. And the other thing one of the things that was always in my mind was that, that's the golden rule. I love the idea behind it is treat everybody how you want to be treated.
Right.
Don't do that. Treat them how they want to be treated. Figure that out.
Sure.
Right? Some people love to be the center of attention, but don't throw that person who doesn't want to be the center of attention in the ring. And so it's those little things like that.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I've heard this before, but the way you said it put it in a little different context of treating people the way they want to be treated and meeting them kind of where they're at, essentially.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm sure you bring that skill into the mental emotional health realm with the hypnotherapy. So let's go continue on in the story. So you finished with banking and just decided to shift gears one day?
So, I ended up in burnout.
Sure.
I wasn't sleeping. Even my perspective of the world was starting to get a little dark, which is not how I generally am.
Sure.
And a girlfriend of mine was going through a really tough time, and I went to go to support her. She signed us up for a workshop, and I was the one crying in the bathroom. And I remember my girlfriend putting her hand on my shoulder and saying, Sherry, you don't need to be this big corporate executive. You love to be outside. You love being in nature, and you don't have to do this. I thought it was really sweet of her that she had lost her mind.
Sorry. I love that she lost her mind.
I was like, she doesn't know me. Like,
right.
Not at all. Then I went home and I told my husband, and he's like, well, she's right. Again, in the state of mind I was in, I thought, now they've both lost their minds. They don't know me. And then it took me a little while to let that sink in. And it was probably 2 weeks later, I gave my notice, with the idea of taking a 6-month sabbatical from work.
Sure.
And it turned out to be a bit of a 6 or 7 year sabbatical, traveling and learning all these different things that back in the day when I was in the corporate world, type A, little angry, and even disconnected, that I started doing all these things. I went and I lived in an ashram for a month and learned how to be a yoga teacher, which, as my girlfriend would point out, was kind of ironic. The first time I went to a yoga class, I was angry that they made me sit down and relax.
Right. Because there were 8 million things that needed to be done. And
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So don't stop. And so I learned all these things that really changed my life. And then it was like, well, I want to put this to a greater purpose.
Sure.
And I'd always been interested in hypnotherapy. And I was like, I don't know if I need another expensive hobby. But I went to class and I knew, I was like, everything I had done up until that point led me to this right now.
I want to go back a step. When you said that, when your friend said that to you, you don't have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the core of why this podcast exists. That's where empowerment starts, is realizing that we don't have to continue doing things the same way, and letting go of those. And it took you, it didn't take you too long. It took you 2 weeks to start that process, right? But 6, 7 years, you said, to fully go in that. But that's the real meat of it, is that we reach a point where we have to realize we don't have to do things this way anymore. And I like that you said, well, she doesn't know me. And part of your personality is that type A, go, go, go personality. But there are other aspects to our personalities. And sometimes when we attach to just one of them, we end up being angry. We end up being frustrated and burnt out because we're not letting all the different sides of ourselves express themselves. We were just talking about this right before the podcast. As a chiropractor, it's very detailed oriented. It's very practical. Here's a misalignment. Here's the logical way to correct that misalignment. And so to balance that out, my hobby is photography, taking photos and capturing beautiful images and capturing people interacting with each other, and those more creative and beautiful outlets gives me more balance and is very enjoyable, even though takes time, things like that, but it's that balance. I just wanted to highlight that moment again, that you don't have to do this is a real big key. So you sat in this class for the first time, kind of on a whim, it sounded like, a hypnotherapy, and then you just knew that's where you wanted to go?
I knew that's where I wanted to go, and that life was going to change again from this great explorer of the world into bringing it into practice.
Sure.
And I do want to revisit what you just said, because that bit of us where we think we have to live up to some standard that we don't have to live up to is what creates a lot of our problems.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we let someone else's standards, or even just the standards we think are real, dictate what we're doing, instead of being able to let some of those go. The cool part about it isn't letting them all go. It's choosing which ones we're going to do.
Because a lot of those standards, those things that we believe, and this is why I love hypnotherapy, they're these unconscious programs that we have, that we've taken on during the imprint stage or at any point in our life. Anything that we repeat over and over for 30 days or more becomes a subconscious habit, things that we say to ourselves. And so it's very easy to not see the forest for the trees, right?
Right.
And that's where we get that imbalance and the friction starts to happen.
We make a lot of assumptions. It's natural. Our brains, as we're, little, like months old, toddlers, little kids, they're trying to understand the world around them, and we make assumptions about everything. And we create these paradigms in our brain. And until we learn that we can question those, we kind of get stuck from those viewpoints.
Exactly right. We are meaning-making beings. And so you're exactly right. At that, whatever age we're at and something happens, we have to make meaning of it. And we happen to be egocentric as well, right? And so it has to do with us. And so we usually make some kind of decision about how we need to be in order for things around us to be okay. And sometimes that works great, and sometimes it's not, because it's done from the age of perception.
Right. Well, and sometimes we don't know they're a thing because they were, like you said, age of perception wasn't the age of language. So we started perceiving things and made assumptions before we developed language to communicate those, An example I use is myself. I had a brother that died when I was 19 months old. I made a lot of assumptions about the world in a time where I didn't have language skills to communicate them or even the memories to remember them now. But as I've done emotional work, as I've done, counseling therapies, hypnotherapy, I've discovered some of the things I assumed about the world and then been able to question those and replace those with different views and say, was that really what was happening? And no, it wasn't. What was happening, and kind of see it in a better light has then helped me better respond to stressors nowadays. Because what people don't understand, and you understand this, but like what some of us sometimes don't understand is that the way we're reacting to stress now isn't the stress now. It's the way we learn to react to stress by responding to a stress a long time ago we couldn't control, you know?
Absolutely. It's like eating your lunch. You're going to digest that food. You don't have to know how you do it.
Right. I had a patient and it was really a cool experience with him. He's had a rough year in terms of just lots of things happens. He lost a few loved ones, had some other stressors. And he said, I'm starting to experience anxiety for the first time. I don't remember experiencing this before. And I said, well, why? And I'm not trying to tell him his experience. I said, but one way people experience anxiety is that when you have a lot of stuff happen, your brain goes into hyper alert. It's like these 2 or 3 or 5 unexpected things happen, and I don't want to be caught off guard again. So I'm going to be hyper vigilant and look for what's the next disaster coming my way so that I'll be prepared for it. And that's one way that anxiety manifests for people. And to see like his eyes like got wide, he's like, that's exactly what I'm feeling, And then I was able to, encourage him. He's got a counseling appointment set up, things like that to try to reframe that. But sometimes even just a simple inner dialogue of looking at our brain or looking at ourselves in the mirror and being like, hey, I understand that you're on the lookout for the next disaster, and I appreciate that. I'm grateful that you're looking out for me. I'm okay right now. You can calm down a little bit, And it sounds hokey a little bit, but at the same time, it works when we're able to just tell the brain, I'm all right now. And it's like, oh, okay.
Right.
Sit back and relax.
It's a version of rewriting the story. Right. Or reframing, or however you want to put it. We are, again, meaning-making machines. And when we change the story, the body and the brain doesn't know the difference between what's real and imagined, right? And so when you work at that level, you can really make some really amazing shifts, and it doesn't have to be hard.
Right.
It doesn't have to be.
It has to be consistent though, right? We tell ourselves that, you said it earlier, like anything we tell ourselves for 30 days becomes reality or in a way, positive or negative, right? If we start telling ourselves positive things, we do that today and tomorrow we wake up feeling the same way, we shouldn't be discouraged. Like, of course, you're trying to reprogram 30, 40, 50 years worth of programming with one time telling yourself something different.
Exactly.
It takes some effort.
It takes consistency and it takes effort. Yes, because there's also layers to a problem. And I found this out even personally. I don't even remember what it was about, but at the time it was something that was really bothering me, and I did a lot of work on it, and I thought it was behind me. And I think I was working with a shaman, and the same subject came up again. And I was really upset. And I was upset that it came up, and I was upset that I'd done all this work and I thought it was beyond me. And I remember he said to me, he's like, oh, but there's always layers. When we move on and we're never the same person from day to day. We're either going forward or we're going backward. And either way, as we change, then those other layers are ready to work with. And in between those things, there has to be some kind of consistency. We're hard on ourselves. It's that negative story that we're always telling ourselves. I'll send my clients homework to write down something positive about themselves every day. I would be better giving them a calculus assignment. They'd think it's easier.
Sure.
So we tend to be really hard on ourselves. And yeah, that consistent positive outlook is a practice.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that this morning, and not to go political, but today's Columbus Day, and there's a lot of different feelings on all sides of Columbus Day. And I was contrasting that with like Queen Elizabeth passing recently, and the way, just observing like how people view people that are no longer here. In the musical Hamilton, they talk about we don't get to tell who tells our story, who lives, who dies, who tells our story. That's not up to us to choose. And I was thinking about it in terms of how we look at ourselves, like some people want to look at like Columbus with only positive things. Oh, let's just see all the great things he did and celebrate those. And others want to just be like, oh, he did negative things. That's all that defines him. And it's like, I'm not saying which one's right or wrong because I don't want to be political in my podcast, but like, what if we were a little more open how we looked at ourselves? We aren't. We're very hard on ourselves as a general rule. And we look at the worst parts. We look at our weakest points, and that's who we assume we are, instead of looking at ourselves with more grace and more, hey, look at also the good stuff you did. And so I did this challenge with myself, and I was looking at, what if I looked at my life objectively and said, hey, look at the things that I've gone through, the experiences I've had. What would I think of this person? And I started to have this greater appreciation for myself, and in a way started to think like, well, this dude's kind of my hero. Like, look what he overcame. Look at the stuff he accomplished, the challenges. It was a very different way of looking at myself than honestly I've ever done. But the more we can do that and, look just beyond our weaknesses, acknowledge our own weaknesses, because that's how we get better, but also look at like, hey, you did the best you could in certain situations. You overcame X, Y, Z. You went through these things and you kept going, and that's a pretty cool thing. So challenging the way we view ourselves is critical to making progress.
It is. It is. And you brought up so many really good points there. It's this idea of where we are and being able to look at it in the lessons and to stick with that. And there's this whole idea, and I with couples, like, there's no right or wrong, right? And the Buddhists talk about meet people where they are, and nobody is all good or all bad. And being able to look at things in that way does really change the landscape of how we can process how we see ourselves and how we see our others.
I like that. I try to teach my kids that, because in media, like movies, there's the good guys and the bad guys,
Mm-hmm.
In the real world, that's not how it works.
No.
There are people that do good stuff. There are people that do bad stuff. And all of us are a mix in between,
Mm-hmm. And there's usually something behind all the stuff, especially the bad stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 kids in high school, 1 in junior high. We talk a little bit about bullying, and we've had some experiences with that. My kids have, I have personally, and when I was a kid, but like, what's wrong with the bully? Like, what's wrong in their life that this becomes normal behavior for them? Like, are they being bullied by their parents? Are they being treated a certain way? Are both parents not available emotionally? All this sorts of stuff. And the more we get to understand people, the more we're really going to appreciate and even love them,
Mm-hmm.
There's one of my favorite books, and I think I've even mentioned this on the podcast before, but it's a book called Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card. It's a classic science fiction book. And then there's a kid who's a general in this army that's trying to defeat aliens. It's a science fiction book, right? But he says something, as he gets to understand his enemy, he can destroy them. He says, but the problem is once I truly understand my enemy, I also love them. And I think that's been something big in my life, that if we can really understand the people, whether it be the driver that cut us off, or, someone that messed over our career or did something worse to us, like, how can we understand them? And doesn't forgive or like get rid of their behavior, but it helps us, it helps us relax. It helps us find a sense of peace. And then it helps us to then feel empowered and to take charge of our own life instead of living as a victim to what happened to us,
That's exactly right. It gives us that agency over who we are as a person. Yeah. And we can choose how we look at things. It's like you said, that driver that cuts us off, we can be like, oh, he's aggressive and mean and not thinking of me. Or it could be like, oh, that person's stressed out trying to get there. Let him in.
Right.
He's having a worse day than me.
I've said before jokingly, but like, hopefully they have someone in the hospital they're trying to go see, like, that's the annoyed tone of me. But really, like, everyone's dealing with stuff.
Oh, yes.
We look at the rates of mental health issues that have only gotten worse in the last 2-3 years. Like, everyone's got stuff they're dealing with. And so if they're doing something that we deem as not great behavior, it could just be their stress coming out, A friend of mine, actually at church a few months ago, was talking about how he was driving and something terrible in the front of him, cut them off, all this sort of stuff. And he was really upset about it. And they ended up pulling into the same parking lot. And he was on his way following them to like give them a piece of his mind, be like, hey, you like really nearly caused several accidents, all this sort of stuff. And they pulled into a parking spot. And as he's getting closer, he sees the person driving the car with their head in their hands, just sobbing.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know what they're going through, and I don't know if he stopped or not, but it really brought him up short. Like, we don't know what people are dealing with, whether that be the issue or it's something else that's
Mm-hmm.
going on in life. We just don't know what people are dealing with. And the more we can, what's the right word for it? The more we can try to understand that or even just let that go, then the more we're going to be able to take control of our own health, wellness, mental health, and lives in general.
Mm-hmm. And again, it's that sense of agency, whether they really had something bad going on or they were just a thoughtless person. If we can put it in a place where, you know what, I'm not going to let that affect me. I'm going to choose, because we can always choose. There's always a choice. I can choose to look at this in a way that's going to benefit my day and how I see things and create a greater, higher vibration in this world, or I can look at it in a more negative way, which isn't going to help anybody.
Absolutely. Well, and this segues into a great next topic is hypnotherapy and some of the things of it, because there's times where we can easily choose those. And there's times where those processes are so intense and they've been running for so long that it feels like we don't have choice
Right.
and we don't have control,
Mm-hmm.
that something small triggers and a very overreaction happens. Or like that, someone cuts us off and we're angry for the rest of the day. That's not a normal response, right? I shouldn't say normal, but that's not how it should be
Right.
working. And so that's where things like hypnotherapy and things come in place. So talk a little bit about that, like how, again, dispelling some of the myths of hypnotherapy, and then how can it help in those types of situations?
What you're talking about is kind of the classical, I am stuck. I keep doing something and I can't understand why I'm still doing it. It's an unconscious program. It's one of those things that, however you got it, maybe it was a decision you made when you were a kid. Maybe it was something that's happened over time, repeatedly. It could be something that was in there and the chaos of life has brought it forward. Now, with hypnotherapy, there's a lot of different techniques and ways to work with that, and it's the most natural and easy thing that we can use because we all have a subconscious and unconscious mind. It's the part that keeps us alive. It's kept us breathing while we're here. We haven't had to think about that. It digests our food, does all of these millions of things simultaneously outside of our conscious awareness.
This is where like the myth that we use 10% of our brain comes in, because we're aware of 10% of what our brain's doing. It's the other 90% that's doing all this subconscious stuff.
Right. Exactly. Our conscious mind is about 10%. And it's fabulous. It's great for planning and organizing and being hypervigilant and doing all these other things. And we need our conscious brains.
Sure.
But when you put it up against the machine of the unconscious mind, it doesn't stand a chance. So when we can use our imagination, when we can use that unconscious process to make change, we can see it and experience it in a whole different way. And we don't even necessarily need to know at 5, this happened.
Right.
If that's part of the process that needs to happen, it will come forward. But we don't need to rehash everything and re-experience things.
Which I think is a big fear for people, that if they've been through some real stuff, they don't want to go talk about it. They're nervous to like cry in front of people, or just nervous to kind of open a can of worms, if you will, which is why hypnotherapy and things like EMDR are really helpful, because it's not, come tell me about your childhood, come tell me about this. It's more of, let's just talk to that subconscious brain.
Right. And we can talk about things to whatever certain extent, but when we talk about things, we revivify them, right? So we're reliving them at an emotional level.
Right.
Who wants to do that? Sometimes as part of the process, when you are in hypnotherapy, you can go through that and experience it in a different way.
Sure.
From a dissociative point of view. That's why it's great to work with a therapist, because they can hold your hand through that part.
Right.
And the other part is that as the client, you're always in control. We won't go into hypnosis or do something unless we want to. Now, it's a very natural state. We are in hypnotic states and all the time, and there's different levels of it, right? As soon as we close our eyes, we start going into a hypnotic state. We go 10 hertz below. We go into that next brainwave state, right? As the person, you're always in control. You're not going to take on any suggestion that's outside of your moral compass. If that were true, the hypnotist would be running the world, right?
Right.
Give me your bank account and
Instead of running, shows in Vegas or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So,
And those shows, they're actually, when you really can understand what's going on, is very fantastic because you have this group of people who put their hand up. They want to be up there. I love hypnosis. I love being in hypnosis. I can go very deep. You would never in a million years see me in a hypnotic state on a stage because it doesn't align with who I am as a person.
Oh, interesting. So it takes a certain kind of person to put their hand up.
Put their hand up. And then you've got a highly trained hypnotist that he knows who to see the people who are really what we would call the most highly suggestible.
Sure.
And then out of that, he's also going to look at who's going to like really kind of wow the audience. And so it's this very amazing selection process.
Interesting.
So
Yeah,
yes, the people that are up there, they're like, I want to let go. I want to put on a show. That's their thing.
That is a fascinating way of looking at it. I'd never thought about these details, but you'd think, they're putting on a show. They're going to be doing more than just waving a little chain and saying you are getting sleepy.
They'll do little things. They'll be like, oh, stand over here. No, stand over here. And the ones who really follow directions, for example, oh, here we go. They're number 1, number 3, they're for sure. Number 2 didn't move as fast and, whatever.
Sure.
So, yeah. Hypnotists, those stage hypnotists are pretty skilled and they're pretty smart.
Well, and that goes along with your point of like you're in control of the situation, hypnosis. And I tell people when I give your card out, I say guided meditation, because that's the way you've described it. And it is. You're guiding people to calming the brain down into this meditative state and not this hypnotic state where you're going to tell them to give your bank accounts, like you said.
And they wouldn't
like that.
anyways.
So,
yeah.
Absolutely.
They would, as soon as you do something crazy like that, they're going to come out of
Kicks you out of that state. There you go.
Or even there's times like when I'm doing something more interactive with the client, they're in a trance state and they can talk to me and we're talking. And if I ask a question and I haven't gotten the question right, they just there's nothing. I rephrase it. Oh, then I can get an answer. It's just what I see is like the subconscious spinning. It's like, that doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't compute. And I've done a couple of sessions with you and I felt very much in control the whole time. And it was just that like guided meditation, calming the system down to a place where then I could, like you said, process and clarify some ways of thinking and come back from that state, hopefully better able to make decisions. So, and you've worked with, so tell me a little bit about the kind of people you've worked with. What are maybe your top 3 favorite things you get to help people with?
That's a great question. I guess my top thing is I love the whole person. And so someone can come in and they might say something is, I'm a nail biter, because that's really kind of tangible and easy, right?
Sure.
And we can start there. But why are you biting your nails? It's usually anxiety or stress or something's going on, right? It's a habit that's become ingrained over time that you're unhappy with, no matter what. And so we might kind of, if it's up to the person, they want to go a little deeper, we can do that. We can start with the nails. That's fine. So I love looking at things as the total person. A lot of hypnotherapists like to work with one thing at a time. I'm like, whatever you want to bring forward, let's look at it. And let's see where they're all attached. And does this make sense? And if this and this and this, do you see how this might be attached? What do you think? And they'll be like, yeah. And I say, if we go after this and we pull that string, then we're going to get rid of a lot of other things, right?
Sure.
So that's the thing that I love the most, is being able to look at the whole person. So a lot of times everyone right now is experiencing some level of anxiety and it's affecting their life in a specific way for them. And so they'll come in and they'll lead with the anxiety, but yes, I have this strained relationship and I'm showing it here and here and all, and then at work. And so we kind of look at that and the underlying things. And it's just kind of remarkable to see how things unwind.
I like to visualize it like a tree or like even, like a weed. You see it growing and if you use the weed whacker and hack it off, you still have the roots and it's going to grow back kind of thing. And I can see that like when you're going down, pull that string, kind of pulling everything up by the root and taking out these whole processes. It's really interesting that your first example was nails. I had not been thinking about this, but I have been a nail biter since I was a kid. And I did a session with you probably about 2 months ago now, I think, 6 weeks. I hadn't put the two to two together, but I have not bitten my nails in the last couple of months. And I'm like, I think that's the only thing that changed. And we didn't specifically go in with that in mind, but that's fascinating because I have tried to quit biting my nails dozens of times. And this is the most successful I have ever been. So that's a pretty cool.
Oh my gosh. So you know how many times I've heard that? Like I say that because most people come in with something else. And I had a client one time send me a picture of his fingernails because he said, I've been a lifelong nail biter, and we worked on anxiety and things like that. And he said, I looked down and I've got fingernails. And I was like, well, that was one of the symptoms.
Yeah.
I said, we could have started there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those are always the fun things when, like, I get that as a chiropractor. People come in and be like, hey, doc, I never told you about this, but I had this problem and it's gotten better since you started working on me. And it's fun because they don't mention it and I didn't think about it at all, but it didn't seem relevant. The funniest thing is trying to figure out how to trim my nails. I've never done that before because I've never had to, but so it's been a new skill I'm learning. But it is those little things that kind of manifest themselves that I love that, how you look at the whole person, And I tend to refer and work with other providers who do that because everything's connected. If you're feeling a neck pain or a headache, there's multiple things that go into that. And so many times as a society, people come in and they're looking for the cause. Why is this happening? And I always question that with them, especially if they say specifically the cause. I say it's usually not the cause. It's the causes. What are the 10 contributing factors that led to creating an environment where you're experiencing the problem you're experiencing? And as we're addressing all of those, or at least more of those, we're going to see better results than if we're just addressing one aspect.
Yes. And then we were talking about like the change that happens. The wonderful thing, and I experienced this personally when I went through my own personal work, and I still continue it, but is I was changing and I didn't notice the changes. And I remember I'd go see my therapist. She's like, oh, how are you doing? And I was always, and this was a long time ago, and I was a little, kind of more critical in the way I would see things. And I was like, oh, she wants me to tell her how good she is or something like that. Not a good mindset, but
right.
I was shifting and I didn't even see it. And
Sure.
she was just trying to let me see it. And finally, but I kept going back because I loved it.
Sure.
And I was like, wow. But it was just like the new upgrade happens and you forget the old stuff.
Yep.
And
the change happens so subtly that it's hard to perceive. I tell people it's kind of like the sun rising. If you go out at 2 a.m. and wait for the sunrise, you'll sit there for hours and hours, and then it'll slowly start to change. And it's imperceptible at the beginning, but gradually over time it gets brighter and brighter. And you can't pinpoint a time where like, that's when it changed. It just was slowly and steadily making that progress.
yes,
And that's the best kind of progress.
it is. It is. And so then there's always a change whether we perceive it or not.
Right.
And it doesn't wear off, because one of the things a client will say, well, I think that session wore off. And I'm like, it might feel that way.
Sure.
It doesn't wear off, but here's what happens. What we do is when we're in session, we spend, 45 minutes to an hour in a trance state. That's concentrated focus. We're creating a new neural pathway. It's there. Now, it's not fully wired and fired like the old one was.
Sure.
And so we've created it. You're on that new road, and it's not as there's not as many lanes. There's not as much asphalt on it yet. And something happens, and it's really easy to go back on that old smooth road.
Right.
So what we do is we're just going to get back on that new road. And the more you use that new road, that new neural pathway, you depotentiate the old one. You start it's eroding as
Sure.
well. So it's also this process that's progressive and cumulative over time.
Well, I read something years ago that's always stuck with me is you can't break habits. You can't just eliminate a neural pathway in the brain. You have to overlay it with a newer one. There's a road from here to Globe. Have you ever driven that road from Phoenix to Globe?
I don't know that I have.
It's a beautiful little drive, but there's a tunnel you go through, and I've driven this road since I was a kid. I grew up out that direction, and driven back and forth, and I've seen the road go through lots of changes and iterations. And if you drive down there, you see the new road. I put that in quotes because the tunnel was built in the 50s or something. But around the corner from that tunnel is the old tunnel. rough hewn, no concrete inside. It's still there, but nobody goes down that. It's a beautiful place to hike, actually. Really cool little tunnel to walk through. It's a beautiful views of the sunset, but that's kind of how it works. Like that old road's still there. It's just we're not using it anymore. We're using the nicer, newer road, and it is about creating that habit. And that's why like sessions build on each other, and you create those new pathways, and then you solidify them, and then you use the positive self-talk. You challenge the way you're looking at things so you can reinforce and keep that pathway as the default versus going back to the old way.
Exactly.
I love that.
Well put.
Well, this was such a fun discussion, Sherry. I appreciate having you on here. Again, Sherry Jackson with Envisage. There, you say it.
Envisage.
There we go. With Envisage, with that well-being.
Yeah.
What's your website? What's a good way for them to find you?
My website is envisagewellbeing.com.
Spell that for us.
ENVISAGE.
Perfect. Perfect. So yeah, thank you for having this discussion. This is a huge, important topic of rewiring the brain. And I love that you hit at the core of why this podcast exists, for those moments where we realize I don't have to do it that way anymore. So thank you again for being on today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.